On that late night, the time had reached midnight, and the restaurant was preparing to close, just like it always did. The place wasn't fancy or special. It was simply a small diner on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place where drivers and night shift workers would gather for coffee and pastries, while truck drivers stopped for burgers in the late hours. By the time it hit midnight, the last customer had left, and the usual closing routine had begun. I was enjoying the peaceful end of the day. There was something soothing about the sounds of the night, like the soft hum of the refrigerators turning off and on intermittently, the fluorescent lights flickering suddenly, and the distant sound of a passing car. All of these sounds had a strange effect on me. They helped me relax after a long day. That night, everything was running smoothly. I wiped down the tables, swept the floor, closed the cash register, then checked the checklist in my wallet to make sure everything was in place. That routine had become second nature to me, so I decided to head to the bathroom to finish my shift. As I approached the back hallway, I heard a strange noise, faint at first, like the sound of fabric rubbing against the tile. I paused for a moment and then realized that the bathroom door was slightly open, which was unusual because I clearly remembered locking it while cleaning the hallway earlier. "Hello," I called out softly, driven by curiosity, but received no response. The only sound I heard was the echo of my voice bouncing off the empty hallway walls. Then the sound came again, this time a whisper, as if someone was speaking in an unintelligible language. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't seem normal. I hesitated for a moment. Could someone have snuck in after the front doors were closed? Sometimes people come looking for a warm place to hide. However, there was something about this situation that made me feel uneasy. It felt different. I took a deep breath to calm myself, then slowly pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, except for a closed stall at the far corner. I took another step toward the stall and called out, trying to keep things normal. "Hello, we're closed. You can't stay here." A moment of silence. Then the voice came back, but it was more forceful now. A mumbling sound, incoherent, filled with anger and distress, which only increased my anxiety. I paused, trying to listen, when suddenly the man shouted from behind the closed door, "Leave me alone. I can't let them find me." His voice was laced with desperation and anger. The man's words were threatening, sending a chill down my spine. This wasn't just someone looking for a place to hide. There was something dangerous about this situation. I tried to remain calm, saying, "Sir, we're closed. If you need help, I can call someone." But the reaction was violent as the man shook the door forcefully, as though I had dared to enter his dark world. Then he started screaming in unintelligible words, angry and filled with helplessness. He was in complete chaos, and I was in a state of shock. I knew I couldn't confront this man alone. Quickly, I took the bathroom keys from my pocket and carefully closed the door behind me, making sure the man wouldn't come out at that moment. I ran to the counter and decided to call the police immediately. My fingers were trembling as I pressed the numbers. Every second felt like an eternity. "Hello, this is Chris from El Diner. There's a man in the bathroom, acting aggressively and refusing to leave," I told the dispatcher. The dispatcher's voice over the phone was calm and professional, which helped reassure me a bit. "The police are on their way. Just make sure you stay away from danger." The minutes passed like hours. Every time I heard the man screaming or banging on the door, my heart beat faster. Fears crept into my mind. What if the man broke down the door? What if he had something dangerous? This place, which had always felt safe, suddenly seemed like a trap. Finally, the sound of sirens arrived, and I felt relief. 2 officers entered the diner, and immediately the tension in the air lightened. "Where is he?" one of the officers asked. I pointed toward the back entrance and said, "In the bathroom. He's been shouting and acting strangely." The officers exchanged sharp looks, and I handed them the key. I didn't want to be near the bathroom when the man came out, so I stepped away from them. The officers entered cautiously, one of them holding a baton, while the other knocked on the door gently. "Sir, this is the police. Open the door and put your hands where we can see them." Then there was silence, a long moment, and then the man's voice grew louder. He repeated his words, but this time, more forcefully. Finally, the door opened. The man looked in a pitiful state, his eyes wide as if they couldn't see, and his clothes were dirty, as if they hadn't been washed in days. "They're after me," he shouted, pointing his trembling fingers at the officers. The officers exchanged looks, then gently led him outside, with one of them saying, "Let us take you to a safe place." After the police had put the man in the patrol car, one of the officers stayed behind to talk to me. "Do you know this man?" he asked. I shook my head and replied, "No." He was shouting and saying they were after him. "He's probably dealing with mental health issues. We'll make sure he gets the help he needs." That explanation made sense, but it didn't ease the unease I still felt. The man's eyes and the wreckage he seemed to be in stayed with me, and even after he was gone, the feeling continued to haunt me. That night, I decided to shorten the rest of the closing routine and locked up quickly. I drove home, but the thing that stayed with me wasn't fear, but the realization of how fragile I am in the face of the unknown. Those quiet nighttime moments I experienced during dinner were the most comforting to me. The night was always a special time, when the activity in the place slowed down and the external noise quieted. I took advantage of this calm to organize things, check the inventory, and make sure everything was running smoothly during these quiet periods. Those moments I spent alone behind the counter or between the tables were an opportunity to take a mental break, where I could focus on the small details that everyone overlooked during the day. A sense of peace prevailed, as if I were part of something steady, unaffected by time or events. But, as is often the case when life is quiet, there was one thing that disturbed this stillness: prank phone calls. These calls started about 3 months ago, and at first, they didn't raise any concern. They were just sounds in the night, like moaning or intermittent laughter, followed by unintelligible words. They occurred once a week, usually late at night, when dinner was almost empty. At those times, the restaurant barely had any customers, and the sounds from outside gradually faded until everything was silent, except for my voice as I answered the phone. At first, I thought it was just a prank from bored teenagers or someone seeking a reaction. But over time, the call started to take a different direction and became more specific. In one call, I heard him ask in an oddly calm voice, "Are you alone tonight?" His voice was low and steady, unlike the previous calls that were filled with laughter or heavy breathing. I felt confused and said, "Sorry." And just as I said this, the line abruptly cut off. I put the phone aside, mocking the situation. I thought it was just another prank. But over the days, this question began to repeat regularly. Every night or two, the same voice, the same question. "Are you alone tonight?" I started letting team members answer the phone, but I discovered something strange. It seemed that the caller knew when I was the one answering. When someone else picked up, they didn't say anything, but once I picked up the phone myself, they would ask the same question. I felt a slight tension in my chest, and there was a strange feeling that came over me whenever the calls came at a time when I was alone. Then came that Friday when dinner was quieter than usual. There were only 2 customers in the restaurant. An elderly couple was sitting together in one of the booths, sharing a milkshake, and a man was sitting in the far corner. The man seemed odd to me, especially since he had been sitting in his spot for over an hour, drinking a cup of coffee without touching the piece of pie in front of him. There was something about his presence that was unsettling. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, but he seemed out of place in this quiet setting. While I was watching the man from the corner of my eye, the phone rang suddenly. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the receiver. Main Street Diner, how can I help you? It was the same caller's voice I had gotten used to, calm and steady. Are you alone tonight? He asked. I felt a chill run through me. I tried to compose myself and answered shakily. Who is this? But the response came calmly. Look to your left. I glanced toward the corner where the man was sitting. He smiled at me with a calm smile while staring into my eyes indifferently. I froze in place, my hand still holding the phone. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling, but the line was suddenly cut off. His smile was still there. He didn't speak. He just kept looking at me. I quickly hung up the phone, trying to calm myself. It might have been a coincidence, but part of me knew that there was something unnatural about all of this. I took a heavy step toward the counter and pretended to check the coffee cup while watching the man from the corner of my eye. He was still staring at me, unblinking. At that moment, Brenda, one of my waitresses, came out of the kitchen. She immediately noticed my tension and said, Jace, are you okay? I tried to appear normal. Yes, just a strange call. Could you keep an eye on table 6, please? Brenda looked at the man, raising an eyebrow in a suspicious expression. Sure. What's going on with him? I quickly responded, nothing. Just make sure he leaves. She kept an eye on the man and nodded her head before returning to her work. A little while later, the man finally got up and headed toward the bathroom. I felt a sense of relief, hoping he would leave, but as he passed by me, he stopped for a moment and said quietly, You should answer your phone. I didn't respond to him. I just kept watching as he entered the bathroom. A few minutes passed before the phone rang again. I picked up the receiver, my voice slightly shaking. Main Street Diner. You didn't ask if I'm still here, the voice said. This made me press the receiver down quickly. Brenda, I called. Call the police. Tell them there's a suspicious person here. Brenda looked at me, her eyes wide. What's going on? I quickly answered. Just do it, no questions. While Brenda was calling the police, I stayed in place, my eyes fixed on the bathroom door. I was in a heightened state of anxiety, knowing that he could come out at any moment. But the door remained ominously shut. About 5 minutes later, 2 officers arrived, and their presence was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Brenda quickly explained the situation and pointed to the bathroom. One of the officers positioned himself by the door, while the other called out, Sir, we need you to come out. After a moment of silence, we heard some movement inside the bathroom. Then the door creaked open slowly. The man stepped out calmly, his behavior unsettling. He didn't say a word. He simply allowed the officers to escort him outside. I stood frozen behind the counter as the officers interrogated the man. Do you have any ID? One officer asked. The man shook his head indifferently. Do you have a phone? Asked the other officer. The man then patted his pockets before raising his hands and saying, No. The officers searched him, but found nothing. No ID, no wallet, no phone, nothing that explained who he was or why he was there. After a few minutes, they allowed him to leave, but warned that if he returned, I should call the police immediately. As he walked away into the darkness, he glanced back at me with a vacant stare, the meaning of which I couldn't understand. A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to focus on the officers as they approached me for my statement. One of the officers apologized and said, Without ID or evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do. If he returns, call us right away. It wasn't entirely comforting, but I thanked them and closed the doors. The next morning, when I entered the diner's parking lot, something black caught my eye near the bathroom window. At first, I thought it was just some trash, but as I got closer, I realized it was a broken phone with a pair of wireless headphones next to it. I felt a heavy weight in my chest, as it seemed he had thrown his phone and headphones out the window before the police arrived. I wrapped the items in a napkin and gave them to the police later. They confirmed that the phone couldn't be traced and that it was the burner phone. The headphones didn't provide any clues. Weeks passed, but the phone calls kept returning to my mind every time the phone rang late at night. I would prepare myself expecting to hear his calm, unsettling voice. He stopped calling, at least directly, but his calm voice still haunted me, and the silence accompanying the calls felt like a real threat, lingering long after it ended. Now, the calls are handled by the staff, as I no longer answer them myself. Sometimes it's not the loud threats or obvious dangers we should be cautious of. It's those quiet moments, the ones that leave a pain in your heart that lasts long after they're over. I had been working the dinner shift for 6 months at that time, and I felt that I had gotten used to its rhythm. The job was flexible enough to allow me to balance it with my college studies, and the pay was good enough to keep my old Honda running. I was content with the situation and didn't expect things to change on that night, which started like any other ordinary evening. But what happened in the following hours turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. As the evening rush came to an end, I felt like I was starting to adapt to the night shift. I was running between tables, refilling coffee cups, carrying trays of food, and balancing everything without stopping. But at that moment, something strange caught my attention. There was a man sitting in one of the far booths in the corner. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual about him. He was a man in his 40s, looking quite ordinary. He was wearing a baseball cap and sitting alone in a dimly lit spot, holding a cup of coffee. But over time, I started to feel that his eyes were following me wherever I went inside the restaurant. Every time I turned around, his gaze would be fixed on me, as if he was watching me closely. I didn't want to appear overly sensitive or exaggerate my reaction, so I decided to ignore it. After all, part of my job was dealing with people who occasionally stared, especially during late-night shifts. But this time it felt different. There was something strange about the way he was staring, something unsettling. It wasn't just a fleeting eye contact or a disinterested glance. It felt like he was studying me. Eventually, I decided to go check on him, so I approached him gently and asked if he needed anything else. He gave me a slight smile, but his smile was a bit unnatural, as if it was forced. He then began asking questions. "You're busy, aren't you?" he said in a calm voice, but his eyes were sharp. I responded while trying to maintain a polite tone. "Yes, Fridays tend to be busy." Then he asked, still watching me intently, "Are you in schools?" "Yes, I'm a college student." I didn't like the feeling that the conversation was becoming too personal. His gaze remained fixed on my face without breaking, which made me feel uncomfortable. He smiled widely and said, "It must be hard to juggle work and school." I quickly replied, stepping back a little. "Yes, it keeps me busy all the time." I tried to politely end the conversation. "Can I get you anything else?" He smiled and said, "No, I'm fine. Just enjoying the view." Despite his calm words, there was something strange in the way he spoke, and that made me feel uneasy. But I pushed that feeling aside, as I had other tables to attend to and needed to finish my work. By midnight, the dinner crowd had started to dwindle. The man had already left about an hour ago, and the table he had been sitting at was empty. I felt some relief when I saw that, so I quickly wiped down the remaining tables and took my tips. The scene outside was calm. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I went to my car, started the engine, and drove home, looking forward to spending some time relaxing in front of the TV. But about 10 minutes into my drive, I felt something strange in the rearview mirror. There was a light ahead of me, car lights following me. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it, as it wasn't unusual for someone else to take the same road home in this small town. But when I turned onto a quieter street, the car stayed behind me. Then I decided to turn again, onto an unfamiliar side street. However, the car kept following me. A strange feeling began to creep into my stomach. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, But with every new turn, I noticed the car was still behind me, as if it was tracking my every move. My heart started racing, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. At that moment, I realized I wasn't imagining things. The person driving that car was following me, and it was terrifying. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the police, trying to stay as calm as possible. 911. What's your emergency? I quickly told them, I think someone is following me. I just left work, and this car has been following me for about 15 minutes. Every time I change direction, the car follows me. Where are you now? Asked the dispatcher in a reassuring tone. I gave her my location while watching the car in the mirror. She spoke calmly. Keep driving. Head to the police station. Officers will meet you there. I quickly pressed on the accelerator, fear pushing me to drive faster. The car behind me didn't back off. It got closer, its headlights glaring in the mirror, making me feel like I was in constant danger. I took a sharp turn, feeling exhausted and tense. You're doing great. Just a little more to go, the dispatcher said through the speaker. Finally, I saw the police station building in the distance, and my heart began to race even faster. I felt a bit of relief as I got closer to the location, and when I arrived, the car behind me slowed down, then suddenly turned around and sped off into the darkness. I immediately jumped out of my car, my legs trembling, and headed toward the entrance of the station. 2 officers greeted me at the door. Are you okay? One of them asked. My hands were shaking as I replied, yes, but they're gone now. They turned around as soon as I arrived. The officers listened to my account and asked me to describe the car, but I could only provide vague details about it. It was dark, probably a sedan, but I couldn't remember more. The drive home after that incident was one of the hardest journeys I've ever had. Every time I saw headlights behind me, I felt threatened. Every turn was filled with fear. When I finally entered my house, I felt the need to check all the doors and windows several times. The feeling of being watched stayed with me for weeks. Every light behind me on the road seemed like it was watching me, and every dark street became fraught with danger. Owning my own diner had always been a dream of mine for years. I had always imagined myself running a small, cozy place, a haven where people could gather for breakfast or stop by on a long journey for a delicious meal. For nearly a decade, the diner had been like a second home to me. I made sure it was a space that welcomed everyone, where regular customers could relax with their favorite coffee, travelers could find a short rest on their long journeys, and locals could enjoy a homely experience in an atmosphere full of warmth. I loved those quiet nights after the rush. It was only then that I could sit in one of the corners, sip a cup of hot tea, and immerse myself in organizing my papers or thinking about tomorrow's plans. These moments meant more to me than I could ever describe. But on that Thursday night, this comfort was shattered in a way I could never have imagined. The evening began as usual. By 8:30 p.m., the pressure of work gradually started to ease. The noise of customers faded as they left, leaving behind the warmth of conversations and the aroma of grilled burgers. Soft jazz music filled the air as I, along with Amy, the energetic waitress with a cheerful spirit, and Joe, the skilled chef, wrapped up the last tasks. Amy was wiping down the counters while Joe cleaned the grill, and we exchanged lighthearted chatter about our customers and the events of the day. As we laughed about Joe's loss in last week's poker game, the bell above the door suddenly rang. We all turned toward the door to see a man enter with slow, heavy steps. His appearance was unusual enough to make us all notice. His jacket was loose, as though it didn't belong to him, and his jeans were torn at the edges, while his shoes seemed like they had seen many days of walking. His pale face and eyes, sunken in shadows, suggested that he hadn't slept in days. Yet, despite his weary appearance, he He didn't seem threatening. He just looked tired. He approached one of the booths by the window and said in a soft voice, "Just coffee." Amy hesitated for a moment before glancing at me as if asking for permission. I silently nodded, trying to look reassuring. "Of course, I'll bring it right away," she replied with a small smile, carrying a coffee pot and a clean cup. The man waved his hand, dismissing the menu, explaining that he was waiting for someone. Amy placed the coffee in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around the cup without taking a sip. He simply stared out into the dark window in silence. The hours passed, and the man remained in his place. The coffee in front of him grew cold, but he didn't move. As it approached 10 p.m., Amy went over to him again, but her tone was less enthusiastic this time. "Sir, can I help you with anything else? We are about to close." He lifted his gaze to her for a moment, then returned to staring at the darkness outside without saying a word. When the clock struck 10:30, Joe came out of the kitchen, having finished cleaning the grill. He poked his head toward me and said, "Do you want me to handle him?" I shook my head, trying to stay calm. "No, I'll handle it. You and Amy can leave." Amy hesitated and looked at me with concern. "Are you sure? He gives off an uncomfortable vibe." I waved my hand, smiling weakly. "Don't worry. He's just waiting for someone. He'll leave soon." I was left alone with him in the diner, and the silence grew heavy. As the hands of the clock neared 11, I decided I needed to put an end to this long night. I approached him, trying to sound friendly but firm. "Sir, we are closed now. If your companion hasn't arrived yet, I can direct you to another place." Finally, he spoke, but his voice was unsettling. "They'll be here soon." Something in his tone made unease creep inside me. I tried to stay calm, turned the open sign to closed, and began locking the doors. But before I could finish, he suddenly shouted, "Do you think you can close the door in my face?" I turned toward him, shocked. "Sorry, but we are closed now. You have to leave." He stood up suddenly, much taller than I had imagined, and shouted loudly, "You took what's mine. You thought you could get away with it." I quickly stepped back toward the counter. "Sir, please leave now, or I will call the police." He laughed loudly and said mockingly, "Call them if you want. They won't stop me." My hand shook as I picked up the phone and dialed emergency services. "There is an aggressive person in the diner, and I am alone. Please send help." The operator reassured me that the police were on their way. I locked myself in the kitchen, watching him through the small window. I saw him try to open the cash register unsuccessfully. Then, in a fit of rage, he grabbed a chair and threw it across the room, causing a loud crash. Afterward, he moved toward the kitchen door and began banging on it hard. "You won't escape. I'll get to you," he screamed madly. Fortunately, the police arrived just in time. They handled him swiftly and took him away. The next day, I set new rules. No one stays alone after closing. I learned my lesson. Caution is always necessary.